What makes sense to me is that we're each called to deeply know ourselves. We're each called to back to the source of our origination, which we all are already. And in that seeking, there are lots of exploration or questions or learning, unfolding that can happen. And integral is one of those possibilities for interfacing with, to then see what comes up in yourself as truth in relation to that. And so the same thing for my sharing, to see what comes up in yourself as truth in relation to whatever I share. This I am that we all are, in my experience, has multiple lenses to perceive, experience through. And the holonic explanation is beautiful and is my experience. And that in the initial awakening, there was a waking to this infinite I am that is one singular I am. And that was the part of the beginning of the process. And if we use that Russian doll, nested doll, imagery, that has been the experience for me of waking up through one layer and the next layer and the next layer and the next layer, and that any one of those layers can awaken to the infinite singular I am. And so when you feel different teachers or hear people speaking from that place of I am, there'll be a different resonance if, depending on where their consciousness is resting in themselves, and then they're opening to that infinite I am. So you can feel a different maturity level in teachers. Or you can wonder, how come I can feel that truth in there, but then they said this like 5 minutes earlier? So, and all of that is still just the palette for you to then relate to see what's true in yourself, and to open to these layers within yourself. I don't know how this part crosses over with Ken's, but in my experience, when there's a opening to, the language I'll use is a player piece on a game board, and there's stacked game boards with the player piece, right? And that an example would be you being the game piece, on the earth plane board, and then opening up to the soul layer, where your soul has a whole different experience, multiple lifetimes experiences. That's a single game piece on another game board, and that keeps happening. And so that in the awakening for me, the awakening first through that I am, recognizing the totality, then the game piece recognizes it is one with the game board. And so that's when people start having experiences of oneness and feeling, oh my God, I'm the flower is me, I'm the room, I'm the plant, right? When we start opening and having these incredible experiences of truth, of being oneness with the whole field. And that when that integrated, then awakeness opened up through the next game piece and the next game board above, and then got to see down through the game board below, oh my goodness, wow, this isn't this one life. All these memories of all these lifetimes and the relationship between karma, of the perfection of everything. Looking from this game board down to that one, I didn't lose my lower game board piece. My mother is still sitting right here. Right? I'm still her daughter. And as a soul, we have a totally different relationship on the soul level. So player pieces are still there, game board is different. And then that game piece wakes up to the wholeness and the oneness of that whole plane, and then starts having a whole other kind of oneness experience. And that, for me, just is continuing to happen. So awakening feels like this, it's like the beginning of self-recognition. And it doesn't matter, this whole question of reincarnation on a certain level seems irrelevant to me, in that each person's experience is going to be perfect for them. And whether that opens or doesn't open, or is important to have it not exist, or is important to have full color screen, it doesn't matter. So one person in a gorgeous, pure, pristine awakening that doesn't speak about past lives is not better or worse, more evolved or less evolved than one who does have that experience. So, I don't know. That's my sort of initial. Well, the other thing I'll speak to. Part of that initial process of the I am, waking up to that infinite I am, and then dissolving into nothing. And in the return of the I am, there was a recognition that I am is made up. Or I am is created. And the key thing in awakening that is consistent for me every time one of these game pieces awakens to the whole plane of wholeness that it's in, that whole dimension, or awakens to the next game piece above, that what's consistent about that is a surrender into nothing. That there is a surrender into non-existence, and that sense of the willingness to not exist, the willingness to let go of your sense of self and the container is essential. Whether it's the energetic boundary of the game piece on the game board, for it to surrender itself as the game board, or to surrender itself into an entirely different reference point of existence. The quality, for me, the qualitative experience is the same. And it's the same as when I sat here and I was about to start speaking. There's an absolute, total non-existence. And yet the body still is here. So, and it seems to me there's just an infinite in both directions, infinite in the magnitude and in the microcosm. So that the shifting that's happened in me physically is happening on a gross level and also on an atomic level, which I am aware of and I experience. And they go together. It appears in two directions, but it's actually one movement. And the going outward, the evolution and involution and evolution are also, from a larger perspective, one thing. So, We can be afraid of nothing because the parts of us that experience are made to experience and made to have a sense of self, made a container for the functioning to happen. This happens on all those levels. The liver got confused that it was the spleen, there'd be a problem. If the cells got confused, there'd be a problem. If you got confused with your neighbor, there'd be a problem. So there's this aspect of creation that is supposed to, like a bead of water, it's supposed to hold itself together. And there can be terror in that innate, intrinsic nature being faced with nothing, being faced with not existing, the experience of not existing. But that's where the freedom lies. Because if you are willing to not be and not exist, then you're not bound by any of those boundaries. They're still honored, they still function, they're still recognized, they're still God, they're still divine, but you're not bound by them. So when the individual player piece opens to the whole plane, then I'm not bound by what seems to be my little experience inside my brain or my emotional reality, but that I can be in total oneness with this gorgeous, incredible being. Or I'm in oneness with the chair and the consciousness of wood and the being that created this support that is supporting this soft tissue body that's filled and with live fluids all moving in this profound, exquisite harmony. So the freedom lies in surrendering as nothing at every stage of the game. This to me would be the essence and the most important thing to share. And all these details of bodies and chakras, and they're rich, they're profound, they're useful. But if you were to take one thing from today, I would say take nothing. And become intimate with that.
I'm sorry, what did you say? You have to take one thing from today.
To take nothing.
Nothing.
The understanding of nothing, and to recognize when you feel terror on the inside of meeting something larger than yourself, or the terror of meeting what feels like non-existence. That's the doorway. Take that path.
Yes, from experience of apparently existing in altered states where there's total peace, non-judgment, this sort of stuff. There really isn't a doer. It's, from my experience, it's not about allowing or letting go or surrendering. It's being. And so when you espouse this aspect of giving up, letting go, dropping the personality, then it implies that there is some doer who has the power to change that reality that's being experienced. And I'm not sure that that's okay.
Okay.
From my experience, when there's a shift to a different beingness, experienceness, It's not that's anything that I directed or allowed to happen. It just was, is.
So I think this is really important, and this is why I always preface things with, you are the wise one. You are the wise one. Your experience is truth.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? And so I wouldn't argue anything. I wouldn't. That's what's important, is for each person to open to that truth. In my experience, the universe is manifesting itself in outrageous splendor of manifestation, experience, and experiencers. And that each of these game player pieces gets to have an experience of self. And I do see free will. And that each of the game boards function differently and the rules are different. And that when the one game piece starts opening to a larger perspective, it's not going to experience its own will anymore, choosing, because there's a larger aspect of consciousness that's functioning. And so the relationship between those will then be, there is no doer. And that in my experience, the continual opening through each of these, that is part of, that continues to happen. So that on a certain level, we get to have the experience. It's in the, again, all I can do is speak from my experience, right? Is that it's part of the gift. It's part of the gift of being able to have the sense of individuation, to have an experience and to have choice. Do you like wearing pink or purple or blue? It's a gift. And then an opening to a larger self, well, there's not choosing anymore. Oh, pink is what's happening, or purple is what's happening. And that the joy, the ecstaticness, the gift of awakening through each of these layers of our consciousness is our own, and gets to be experienced through each individual lens as that wants to happen. So, I don't know if that helps address both with a little bit of mapping and framework of both sort of, in Ken's thing, both sort of the interior and the exterior, right? If you're looking at the mapping of the layers, but then the inner experience gets to be whatever it is.
So a curious point is, when you shift from sleep to non-sleep, when you open your eyes, is everything out there and you're totally immersed in dualistic aspects of human condition? Or can you do anything with that? At this nanosecond, when the awareness is present within, can you do anything with shifting that, your perception, so that you do not take everything in a dualistic aspect?
What's your question? Like in terms of you're asking about my experience, but what is the heart of what you're trying to get at?
If you believe in separation and dualistic aspect of human condition, the initial nanosecond when the dualistic nature of being as a separate person with a personal consciousness, when that happens, are you personally, in your experience, able to shift and go, no, that wall is not separate from me. We are within oneness. Have you had that experience where you direct, this is being totally immersed in dualistic aspect of being, but where you can shift and go, no, that's not out there, it's all one. And I'm not perceiving it as out there.
It's hard for me to answer your question because I don't experience it through the frame that you're framing things. So it's hard. It's like I'm trying to get in. That's why I was asking, "What's your question?" Because I'm not. In terms of these player pieces and the game boards, for me, there's when the integration through that game board, it seems to sustain. So then when the awakening comes in through the next player piece and then awakens through that game board, it seems to sustain. So that there's a fluidity of consciousness. And this is why I was saying the nothingness is the freedom, because when you're not then identified and bound by the structures that are made for existence to happen, for the appropriate differentiation to occur. When you're not bound by those, there's a fluidity. So there's a fluidity of awareness of my thoughts and then awareness of other people's thoughts. There's a fluidity of my emotional experience and other people's emotional experience. There's a fluidity of my physical being and the physical space. So there's just, it's like the camera lens, the aperture just shifts. Oh, I'm speaking. So speaking is coming from nothing and coming out here. Oh, we're going to do a healing session? Okay, then focus shifts and I'm open through a much, much larger aspect of consciousness and present with everything. Oh, we're done with the healing session? Okay, that's going to close. Oh, we're going to eat. Oh, I'm hungry. What do I want to eat? Right, so there's a fluidity of that, which is also true in dream state, or waking from dream state. There's an awareness of, oh, coming into the body here in this room. I'm feeling the plane flying however far away it is. Or I remember as a kid. My mom's sitting here, right? So it's like I'm remembering as a kid at Granddad's that I could feel a train from so far away. And this was before any of the shifting happened, and being surprised, how come I could feel the train that far away when I was in that in-between awake dream state, So that was before any of this. So I think when we're all in these in-between states, we're much more connected with the larger aspect of what we are. So, whereas now it's just more fluid. It's just more fluid. So, yeah.
When you're talking about fluidity between the different lens focuses.
Did you say fluidity?
Fluidity?
Yeah.
Between the different dimensions, the different plane boards, as you describe it. On your personal experience, did you go to a metaphysical fluency school, or was it, or did being able to shift your focus or shift your dimensional lens, was that part of your unfolding?
Do you mean a school on this plane or a school in the other dimensions?
Other places.
I teach in one of those. I had someone in Kauai come up to me, and he said, "Oh, you're my teacher in such and such a place." That was sweet. There's something else I want to say about that. I mean, awakening is like remembering. That's remembering. Yeah, I'll just share a little bit about that. When I started to remember that, and that I was doing that, started to become aware of doing that, there was at the same time there was a shifting to working with groups, and I was just going to start working with groups and hadn't done that before, and had a personality tremor of, I haven't done that, and then this larger memory just fully flooded, and being aware the rules are different. So you create the room. You energetically create the schoolroom, and you put in the schoolroom everything that's needed for what each person who's going to be in that learning experience, what they need. So one of the reasons I love Harry Potter. There's so much. What is that, the room of requirements? There's a room that you go in and what you need shows up in. It's like that, right? Because things are created instantaneously, and so anyway.
The tools and the master all at your fingertips when you're making Thanksgiving dinner. Something magical happens when it seems set.
Yeah. You know, I want to say something else to this piece too. And this touches a little on Ken's stuff, but I'd have to talk to him more to make the merge, you know, if it's there. But that there's this aspect of consciousness of the infinite I am that's empty. And then there's what I refer to as Devic consciousness, the consciousness of all the substance that is in union with our sense of self to have an experience. And that is true on these other realms. And those gifts and skills come with harmony and love and truth and balance. There's not a I say this, there's, like, if we separate things out, right, we can separate out love and power, you know, and truth, and they seem to have different flavors. But in our wholeness, they're not separate from each other. And the Devic realm is then intrinsic, it's internal, you're in oneness and there's harmony. And manifestation arises not from power or control, but arises from love and truth and harmony. And in that there is a surrendered self of the non-doer, of the no self, of a much larger intrinsic consciousness unfolding. It also seems to me that there's a learning, that there is the experience of learning and evolution and growth, and that we get to have the experience of things in separation to deeply understand ourselves. We can see them better. You know, I was using colors as an example. If you want to understand blue, hang out with blue. If you want to understand red, hang out with red. You know, and in that deep understanding, then there's purple. And that understanding of the blue and red is then intrinsic to the purple, but then purple is something else. And so we get to have this individual experience of everything. And as we continue to open and awaken to ourselves, the outside pieces all start to come back and fit into this seamlessness that they actually are already. Yeah.
Would you say that there's an evolutionary dynamic to this?
Yeah.
Yes.
So on each of these different game boards, it appears to me, my experience is the rules of physics are different. So I can't, take my brain and go stick it in Lynn's head. But in the mental plane, we can totally share thoughts with each other.
Right.
I can feel her emotional reality, so the rules are different. And that on each of these levels, the purpose and the function is different. So the purpose of our skull is to keep all this, precious stuff, in a place where it's going to function well, right? And there is also a mental boundary. It's not appropriate to go picking around in your neighbor's brain, right? And then there are certain times there's an appropriate sharing. So the rules of physics then relate to all of those functions, and in these upper levels, the physics or the rules, the purpose and the function and the physics are evolution, a dynamic evolution that pulls consciousness back to itself, pulls it back to truth, which is what we all feel. And we feel it as a real sensation. It has a real gravity. It has a real direction. Right? Because our systems, each of these game pieces, are created to respond. Right? We get to have the outward experience of going out to experience the red and purple and blue. And at the same time, there's an intrinsic call to truth. And the whole inner-outer thing being completely made up, you can go out into blue and you're going to end up in the same place you'd end up if you went in through your heart to God. Everything's going to end up as the same thing because the whole time-space thing is all completely created for experience to happen, which is different on each of those game boards. Yeah. Let me see if there are other questions from other people. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So when operating in a nonlinear, multidimensional reality, and you're working with balancing another human, do you sense that you're clear of your own conditioned personality, and that what's moving the energy is nothing that you personally are connected with?
I'm going to give you a much fuller answer to your question.
No, that's all that we want is fuller.
So, when I am functioning in that role, my consciousness is open with a vast number of other beings that are in different game boards.
Okay.
It's a collective happening, and it's too much power for any one individual to have in any realm. So there's there's like checks and balances that work, as opposed to our government, which is having a little trouble with the checks and balances. And each being has a particular task. All of our consciousness is linked together, so I have access to what they're all seeing. They have access to what I'm seeing. There's when the healing started, however many years ago, it was on a much smaller scale. I was working with one person at a time, so there were 5 guides, and we were working with their emotional body, their mental body, and then as my consciousness started to shift, then I started seeing the soul body, and then I started seeing light grids, and I started seeing these layers. And then when I started working with groups of people, the number of guides got bigger. The dimensions expanded, larger dimensions. And I started seeing like the dimensions stacked in each person. So if there were 7 people, I'd see, the layers of their being, like little columns with each of the stuff that was happening in them. And then as things continued, I started to see more the collective. So I might see the whole, sort of like a collective soul body, which then had all of that information together in a package, right, in all along. And now, I mean, it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And I've taken a break from doing sessions for a few months because there's been a lot of shifting happening for me. And I did a little short session last night, and it was, I don't know how much I shared last night. It was kind of mind-blowing for me, but I've been seeing people's astrology, and so when I talk about there are physical aspects that are connected with our consciousness on all of these levels. So I've been opening through this larger cosmic level and being with the actual astrology of someone's birth and the trajectory of that astrology through a lifetime. And so last night in the session, that little mini session, I was seeing each person's, as opposed to their emotional body, mental body, soul body, I'm seeing the movement of their astrological patterning through this life. And that's what I was seeing, these columns of that, of everyone, and seeing the probability fields around each of those alignments. So I was seeing how free will is engaged and that there's a probability field of how that's going to manifest, but free will engages that. And what came in that session was this profound magnitude of light with all those forces of evolution that would support and align each person to the most resonant probability coming forward. So it was like a fine-tuning. There's no action on my part. There is no personal will doing anything other than the personal will completely aligning and surrendering to the movement of God or the movement of creation, of the highest principles, frequencies possible. And in the beginning, when I was working with one person, in my sweet little office on a futon in Northampton, I would see the substance of the emotional identification. When we identify with something, there's a contracting and an identifying with that experience, which brings it into form and it sustains. And you can find it in the body, you can find it in these different layers of the bodies. You can find it in the soul body. And I would see those, and the practice then was the way the guides were working. One would be holding the container, another would be looking through all the karmic material to make sure that supporting in one particular way wouldn't trip up something else in an unhelpful way. Another would be bringing in the frequencies that were most useful to support the shifting. There are lots of different parts for supporting the whole. And so that, and my role could be any one of those. And I didn't choose what any one of those roles was. There's a surrendering to, okay, what's happening? And at some point I was actually then asked to be the overseer, which was terrifying. This was still in my office, my little office. And each of the roles are shared. There's a learning that's happening on all levels. But even in that role, one is not left alone as a place of power of doing. There were guides overseeing me in my overseeing with all these checks and balances of understanding how the whole thing happens. In the beginning, I had never worked well in my human life with teams. I had a lot of judgment about the quality of things that were happening that that didn't resonate with me, and I had a hard time with it. And when I stepped into doing this group healing, it was such a profound relief, and amazement for me of recognition of how teams are supposed to work. And that there's a hierarchy. The beings that there are masters, and then there are beings that are not masters, because evolution is happening. And so the beings that aren't masters need to see how a master makes a choice around the situation. But the whole thing is in relation to each other with a profound respect and equality. The being who is not a master is equal to the master. There is equality with a recognition of the difference of maturity. And there's no judgment. If one has a deed, so sometimes part of the role is to reach down to denser frequencies that are really uncomfortable and sticky and coagulated where we get stuck. That's part of creation. And someone has to do that in that group, you know, and when it was me, then I would also be aware of why it was perfect. That in this high frequency gorgeousness, I'm the one who's going down and hanging out in the muck. You know, because I needed to be able to stay in muck and resonate light. I needed to practice that. And when I saw another guide being asked to do that, I got curious. How come they got to do that? You know, and seeing, oh, because they need to practice. They're out of a body doing the healing work. They needed to practice moving through the dimensional frequencies and coming back up without getting stuck. So that's why they needed to do it. And another time when I was resting in a higher frequency in myself, it was my role to do it. And I did it in a completely different way. There's just a resting as truth and the radiance of love, and love just radiates through that thing, and then the thing that's caught rises up to love, because that's what happens. So there's a profound, it's a profound thing that's happening. And I am humbled and in awe and gratitude in every single session that I have the honor to participate in.